Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us. Today, we are going to be talking about a new book that's going to be released soon. It's called Against All Odds. It documents the story of the Indian IT sector from its inception to now and a little bit in the future. The authors of the books are all of them stalwarts of the IT sector, and we're lucky to have them here to speak about the book. So we have Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan, Mr. N. Dayasindu, and Mr. Krishnan Narayanan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, I wanted to start with you. The youth today has grown up with the IT sector being the behemoth that it is right now, and they've seen that, especially with the current government, you've seen a digital push that has been done in a very big way. And so the name Against All Odds comes as a slight incongruity. So could you tell us a little more as to why that was the name you chose?
So remember that the industry started in late 70s, early 80s. And in those days, internet was not there, venture capital was not there. The world was not expecting a world-class service or a product out of India because we don't have examples of those in those days. And the software computing industry is new to India to some extent. There was a computing industry, but primarily focused on the hardware side at that point. And only much later, in fact, after 2000, that people started believing that this is going to become a very large industry. Even in 1999, when Infosys went public, our revenue was $125 million. So, much smaller than what it is today. And industry's revenue was also much smaller. So that's the reason why we have, titled the book as Against All Odds, because it was in spite of a lot of challenges that the country had at that point.
How fascinating, because the book actually does document a lot of the challenges and how the IT sector has kind of emerged victorious. And so, and in doing so, it goes through a lot of anecdotes and a lot of stories. Mr. Dayasindu, I just wanted to ask, is this based on your memories from the sector, all three of you, or was there a whole lot of research that went into it? How did you go about researching this book?
So this we started off with the Itihasa History of Indian IT project, which was conceived by Chris. So what we did was to identify milestones that defined the evolution of Indian IT over the last 6 decades. And then we reached out to those key actors who've actually made these milestones possible. So we sat with Chris, identified those milestones and the key actors, and then Chris wrote to these key actors and requested them for an interview with us. And the interview was very interesting because we had a 2-step process. The first one was to jog their memories and get their recollections of what they did at that time and what was the what were they thinking about it at that time, and also the impact of what they did and how it has influenced Indian IT. So one thing which I want to add here is that we interviewed over 50 leaders. And all of them were so generous with their time and in terms of recollecting what happened around those key milestones. So one of the things that we see and hear is that hey, this company is competing with some other company, but when we approached them, it was that the camaraderie of the Indian IT industry was so evident. So these the divisions between companies and all that just blurred, and it was just, hey, Indian IT and we are all part of this one big happy family of Indian IT professionals. So it was fascinating.
That's actually very, very heartening to hear, because from the outside, the IT sector, I mean, it's very dear to all of us Indians, because it's a bright spot in our economy. It's what a lot of people abroad know India for, and so it's very good to hear that the companies actually don't have the kind of animosity that often sensational news might make it out to be. So you had mentioned that Mr. Gopalakrishnan had mentioned some of the highlights. So, sir, if you could tell us a little more, maybe 5 or less or more, whichever number you choose, highlights in India's IT past that changed the course of the sector.
So, first of all, it's the setting up of these companies. It really happened in the late 70s, early 80s. IBM exited India in 1977. It created a vacuum, and a lot of the computers that were installed in those days had to be maintained, supported. It also allowed entry of Unix-based machines, mini computers, and that triggered a wave of entrepreneurship. So most of the companies that are today large started in late 70s, early 80s, and so I would say that's the first milestone. The entrepreneurial opportunity, the entrepreneurial energy that was created in late 70s, early 80s. The second is the industry working with the government to create the policy around software technology parks.
And this was when, sir?
This was about 87 time frame. And this is important because the government recognized the opportunity this industry provides in terms of exports, in terms of job creation, and decided that they will create a single window mechanism of giving all the clearances, including your export certificates and building permits and everything. So the genesis of that was the conceptualization of software technology park and the rules around software technology park as a single window mechanism. And even today, I say that we talk about single window clearances, but here is an example of government doing it brilliantly, and as I have not seen this repeated elsewhere. All we need to do is look at the success of the software technology parks and repeat it or duplicate it. The third milestone is General Electric coming to India, Northern Telecom, Nortel coming to India to develop software through their partners in India. In fact, this kind of changed the perception. If multinational corporations would source their software from India, then here is something that is possible, that is feasible, that can actually benefit these companies. So I think it was probably the first time multinational corporations decided that they will source software services from India, software development in India. That is around the same time that the first direct communication links were also set up to the US from India. First was by Texas Instruments, then General Electric and Infosys, etc., started setting up telecommunication links. The next milestone is listing of Infosys in Indian Stock Exchange in 1993 and US Stock Exchange in 1999. So Indian Stock Exchange allowed us to get investors into the company, get external investors into the company. Till then, the company was bootstrapped. This was the first instance of going out to get funding for the industry and saying that this is an industry that that can give you returns, especially in the public markets, and then the industry returned money to investors for many years running, right? So it became a darling of retail investors and institutional investors. And we replicated that in US also. So the listing on US was to tell the world that here is a world-class industry which is governed very well, which has highest quality of standards, which has a clientele that's a who's who in the world, and which is giving you better returns than comparable services companies in the world. Right? We were listed on the most competitive of exchanges. So I would say these are the milestones, and of course then the industry had explosive growth enabled through the Y2K, the telecom growth, the telecom industry, growth of the internet and things like that. But rest, as they say, is history.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Narayanan, I actually wanted to ask you about two particular events that caught the public's imagination when they happened. And so, one is indeed Y2K, and the other is the Satyam Scandal. And how did these two change the course of the Indian IT story?
Right. So Y2K indeed was a huge opportunity, but the genesis of Y2K was it was just a bug fix, right? It was not a big development or anything of that sort. It started off as a bug fix, but the opportunity was huge, and the IT companies which went and did it, in that process they ended up understanding the processes and systems of the customers so well that when the opportunity finished, the CIOs there realized, hey, this is fantastic. These guys now have such a significant understanding of our processes. Why not retain them for other work, right? And so of course, the Y2K itself was huge. In fact, in the book, we talk about how the Y2K opportunity itself was perhaps more than the size of the industry in 98. Just that 2 years. But the significant opportunity came post that, because they realized the sort of the process systems that the IT companies brought. So I think that really led to a lot of significant opportunities subsequently. And the other very interesting thing, even for Y2K, was the sort of factory approach which many companies adopted. And so just like you have automation in manufacturing industry, they kind of brought that similar factory automation kind of an approach, and each process, the entry criteria, exit criteria. So we talk about that in the book. So those were all very great learnings for the industry in terms of how to take a process view. On Satyam, of course, the scandal was, it was shocking. But at the same time, I think everybody recognized or wanted to communicate correctly that this was a problem of one company and not an issue of the industry as such. That was one which they wanted to communicate. I think the way in the aftermath of that announcement, the way the industry, the government, right? These are all competitors. They could have gone after the customers if they wanted, because here is a thing vulnerable. They could have gone after the people. But I think the way NASSCOM brought the industry together, the way the industry also approached it, and the way the government also came, I think this is a phenomenal example of collaboration that we see. We detailed it out in the book as well, which is fantastic. It's a great learning. I mean, this is a learning for many such kinds of situations. I mean, it need not be a crisis like this, like a scandal, but several other crises. But how can these different parties come together? I think those were the learnings, I would say.
Right. And you, in particular, you mentioned NASSCOM and the government. So, Mr. Gopalakrishnan, this leads perfectly into my next question, which is, what has the role of the government been, and on the other side, what has the role of bodies like NASSCOM been in the growth and development of the IT sector?
See, government definitely has a important role to play in growth of any industry, an enabling role. In fact, I always say that the dual role of government, which is enabling and enforcing. But first you need to enable, otherwise there's nothing to enforce, right? And many a time you forget the enabling role and think about enforcement role. Government is here to put hurdles rather than enable you to leapfrog. And by creating the STP rules, by creating low-cost telecom links in the beginning, the BSNL links enabled us to connect to our clients at a much lower cost. They also changed the rules such that these links can be shared across customers. So government played, I think, important role, just sufficient to enable the growth of this industry, and work very closely. And that just sufficient is very important. They looked at what all ways can we actually help the industry. And I think that was very important for the industry to gain scale. So we could actually invest back into growth because of the tax breaks given, and grow very rapidly. So government played an important role in the growth of the industry. NASSCOM played an important role in bringing us all together, looking at issues related to the industry. What should the response of the industry be? So, for example, there wasn't enough trained manpower available or coming out of our educational institutions. So the larger companies actually invested in education and training infrastructure. Infosys, for example, set up the 600-acre Mysore campus, where entry-level training, foundational training was held. And even though attrition happens, we said that these people will go on to build the industry. So we didn't really worry about how long they would stay. We would still invest in training those people to transform them to be world-class software engineers. So NASSCOM, played this role of bringing the industry together, looking at larger issues, building an industry. And I firmly believe that to have an impact, something must scale up, right? And by creating multiple world-class companies, we created a huge impact. It was just not one company which created the impact, but multiple companies. And there are successive generations of companies, right? Later on, you had Cognizant, Mindtree, now Happiest Minds. So there are waves of generations of companies that came behind, which took the baton and ran this marathon. And the larger companies continue to be very impactful, very influential, and NASSCOM balanced all these things. When multinationals came, they also became members of NASSCOM, and NASSCOM made sure that the industry spoke with one voice with the government. And government also found it very easy to work with the industry, because all you need to do is contact NASSCOM or talk to NASSCOM to understand the issues, challenges, how they should be addressed, how they can be addressed. When policies were created, these policies were created in consultation with the industry, because there is a single body which represented the industry. So NASSCOM played a very important role and continues to play an important role even today.
That's great. So now coming to how the IT sector has been earning its revenues largely, or recently, or I would say over the last 15 or 20 years, it's been very export driven. Europe, the US have been very large markets for the Indian IT industry. But where that has been driving huge growth over these years, now it's starting to impact a little bit with crises in those regions are now having an impact on the domestic Indian industry. What I wanted to ask you, Mr. Narayanan, is when do you think that demand from within India would be sufficient to kind of wean the IT sector away from global revenues, and they'll be comfortable enough that they aren't held hostage to these external crises?
Right. So it's an interesting question. In the book also, we refer to a stage where the Indian government became a big buyer of IT services, and that brought a lot of companies actually to come and invest in their India arm for offering the services to the Indian governments. I think there are 2-3 interesting things. One, of course, as the economy of India itself grows, as our GDP grows, so will the willingness to spend as a percentage of that on IT and productivity improvements and so on. So that naturally will see an increase in expenditure on services. The second, we are seeing some interesting model in the sense, the software as a service and different ways in which the Indian companies are absorbing. And so we are already seeing the SaaS kind of models getting accepted. We in fact reference the sort of the TCS story and TCS Ion and so on as examples of how they have leveraged and offered services to the Indian market. And the final thing I would say is this trend that we are seeing now of public digital goods, right? The Aadhaar based eKYCs, the UPI and ONDC and so on, right? So each one of them is bringing in digitization in different ways, and this will now lead to a lot more opportunities. So if you take ONDC, which is the Open Network for Digital Commerce, a lot of effort will go in bringing the retailers onto the or the people onto the network, which is a service. Absolutely. So that all of that will lead to newer opportunities.
I just want to add one very important point here. For an industry to be called global, its revenue must reflect the GDPs of the countries. Yes. Right? So India's GDP is about $3 trillion out of a total GDP of $90 trillion, which is approximately about 4%. So if you are truly a global company, your revenue from India should be around 4%, because it must be reflecting the GDPs of the world, countries of the world. Yes. Right? It's slightly more because we have an advantage domestically, and so Indian IT industry on an average derives about 10 to 15% of its revenue from India, rest from rest of the world. So it's a reflection of the size of the GDP of the world, and that's why it's called truly a global industry.
I understand. And now this is on the software side. So Mr. Dayasindu, I wanted to ask you that first, in the growth of the IT sector, have there been any successful hardware stories? And even just looking ahead, if you think that India could become a sort of powerhouse or hold its own in terms of hardware in the future?
Sure. So as Chris was mentioning, we had a lot of activity in building mini computers during the late 70s and early 80s. So and we were reasonably good in terms of those mini computers. So an example that comes to mind is a Bangalore-based company, Wipro. So Wipro started off by building mini computers using standard Intel microprocessors. So initially the West, the companies there were using Intel microprocessors to build computers that would serve one person, so microcomputers or personal computers. Whereas Wipro 86, which was the model that had introduced in 81, mind you, this was the same year the IBM PC was introduced. So Wipro 86 was a computer which was a multi-user computer, which was built for Indian businesses to to do their computing for accounting and HR and finance and things like that. So not only that, we were also very innovative in terms of what we did in terms of designing our microcomputers. So Wipro 386 was a model again based on Intel microprocessor, which was able to run Unix. So this was among the first time in the world that Unix was ported onto a Intel microprocessor. And in fact, we've documented in our book that the Intel CEO then, Andy Grove, wrote a letter of appreciation to Wipro. And Wipro was one of the beta test centers of Intel at that point in time. So we did have this, a prowess in hardware, but subsequently our policies which allowed import of hardware ensured that we didn't concentrate much on or we couldn't concentrate or invest so much in our R&D. So our Indian companies, became resellers of the partner's computer. So at one point in time in the early 80s, so we were good. So that's in summary what we were. And I guess that based on the investments we are doing in hardware right now, I'm sure that in the future there would be a lot more opportunities for Indian companies to innovate and to come out with innovative hardware products.
Right, fantastic. And now, Mr. Gopalakrishnan, if you'd allow me to take a little diversion into your philanthropic activities, you've done a lot of work with the Infosys Science Foundation and in sectors like healthcare and brain research. So I just wanted to ask you, I mean, given that we are now slowly emerging out of the COVID-19 pandemic, what is your view, your take on the mental health crisis, or if it is a crisis that has emerged out of the pandemic?
Definitely, the pandemic changed our way of living, right? Suddenly, we had to shift to work from home. Children were also stuck at home, so we had to take care of them. If husband and wife are working, they are also working out of homes. It changed our way of living, and then after COVID, of course, transitioning back to the older ways of working, which required any readjustments again. And this has put tremendous pressure. And then there was pressure around the healthcare crisis itself, because COVID is one disease where nobody can help you, right? People are quarantined, right? That puts pressure on people. So this is I think, once in a lifetime crisis. Having said that, definitely, the pressures are increasing. The need to perform, the need to be competitive, need to, especially in the IT industry, need to compete with companies and people around the world, puts definitely a lot of pressure on individuals, and longer working hours. When you work for a startup, also longer working hours. All these things put pressure on each individual. And you also need to learn continuously. You have to update your knowledge, because you're in a field where the innovations are coming fast and furious. So you need to keep learning also. All these things do put pressure. I think the answer to this is really not slowing down. The answer to this is to learn to manage. Given such an environment, how do you manage your time? How do you manage these work pressures? How do you set reasonable expectations of what success means? What should you do, etc. How you manage your family life, etc. is very important. And I think that's something, I think, as a society we need to actually educate our youth to manage their times better, manage their relationships better, etc. It's not going to go away. It will have to be addressed, and then only you can find answers.
And would you say that it is also important for the companies also to evolve in their expectations from their employees, knowing that this is the new reality, that their expectations from employees also must evolve? Do you think?
Yeah, a lot more flexibility at workplace is needed, because you expect people to work longer hours, so you need to be a little bit flexible. If they say that I need to take off on a particular day or something like that, or I need to work from home. So flexibility is important at workplace. Similarly, companies also must bring resources or bring expertise into the workplace to help employees if need be. So the whole field of mental health, which as a society we have been actually ignoring. We don't acknowledge that this is a problem, right? At family level, etc. We are very reluctant to acknowledge that somebody has a mental problem and things. So somebody needs help. So this is accept that this is a potential disease condition, and it can be cured with proper help. I think it can be at the workplace, it can be at the societal level. We need to address these things. We have, sadly, we have very small number of professionals in these areas in the country. So we need to invest in creating capability, capacity, all of these things. And that's why I'm personally looking at mental health, but a different aspect of mental health. I'm focused on how your mental capabilities decline over time as you age, neurodegeneration as you age, and the disease conditions arising out of that, like dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson, which don't have cures yet. So can we help develop cures, understand these diseases better, understand why they happen, and how can we prevent, how can we cure, or how can we even give a good quality of life for these people. So this is the area of research that I'm supporting.
Right. And is there something exciting that you feel is happening in these areas of research relating to the brain, relating to age-related diseases? Are we on the cusp of something big?
So it's very difficult to say, are we on the cusp or something? But we are on par with the rest of the world in terms of doing this kind of research. So at the Center for Brain Research at Indian Institute of Science, we are doing longitudinal study of 10,000 people over 10 years to figure out how they age. And if they develop any disorder, then can we go back and look at biomarkers, which could have actually probably help us identify the situation early on, and then is there something unique about these diseases in India? Because we consume a lot more spices and things like that, turmeric and things like that. So is there a correlation between these things? So there are a lot of interesting opportunities for doing research. At the Center for Brain Research at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, they are looking at, again, a unique aspect of development of brains, which is how does the brain develop at the cellular level from conception. So, the infant brain and how they age, and when there is a disease, what impact it has on the brain. For this, you require, because you can't go inside a living person's brain, you need access to cadaver brains, again, which is available in India, and people donate their brains for research causes, and these are now being studied at the molecular, at the cellular level. And again, I believe that this will actually help us understand changes that happen as we age in the brain, or as the brain develops a disease condition, what changes, etc. See, human brain is one organ which is very different. Every person has a different brain, right? And so it's important to understand us at the individual level.
How fascinating. And this, of course, then leads to the next question, which is, could you tell us a little bit about how you would judge the scientific temper in the country right now, the acceptance of science and the interest in science that right now?
See, I do not see any issue with the talent that is there. The people doing this research. I also feel that money can buy the best of the equipment today, right? These people are trained in the best of universities, and if they are given the proper equipment which money can buy, I think they will do world-class research in India. They require support in terms of funding. So this is where I believe we are now, we need to focus on. We need to increase our investments into basic and applied research. Currently, India invests about 0.7% of GDP on research. I would like to see this go to 3% of GDP, 1.5% from government and philanthropy, government, and 1.5% from private sources, which is industry and philanthropy. Today, that industry and philanthropy is only 0.1%. So it has to go up by 15 times what it is today. And government funding has to go up by about 2 to 3 times. That will put us on to a good runway to take advantage of the knowledge economy that we are in. We are at the cusp of breakthroughs in many fields. If you look at healthcare and personalized medicine, preventive medicine, if you look at automotive, we're transitioning to electric vehicles, new battery technology. If you look at the changes that are happening in retail, e-commerce. So every industry is going through a transition, space, every industry is going through a transition. And if we can actually identify these transition points and invest in that, we will actually lead in these areas, because everybody is at the beginning. So we can actually leapfrog and we can lead in some of these areas, and I firmly believe that we need to do that. And I'm, of course, investing in my own way in making this happen.
Right. And this actually then leads very neatly into and back to the book and the IT sector. Mr. Dayasindhu, if you could tell us a little more about the education sector, in particular the IITs, and what their role has been in the past in developing the IT sector, and looking ahead, what more is needed from them, if anything.
Okay, so how did IT education start in India? So it goes back to IIT Kanpur when they got their IBM 1620 in 1963 as part of the Indo-US program, KIAP program. So that was a time when Professor Mahabala, Professor Rajaraman started a course on Fortran. So this was not only for the students of IIT Kanpur, but it was also a course that industry folks and folks from the government could attend. And this was the seed around which the future capability building programs around software and programming started. And there are a lot of anecdotes about how the computer came to IIT Kanpur, and about Mr. Murthy, who was one of the students of the MTech course there, specializing in computer science. So, what was his reaction on seeing the computer for the first time, or did he even see the computer for the first time? So, that's about IIT Kanpur, and they continued with the tradition of computer science through the 70s and 80s. They were the first to start a BTech program in computer science. So, IIT Madras received what was probably one of India's biggest computer, and also Asia's biggest computer, the IBM 370. In 1973, thanks to a German grant. And Professor Mahabala came along with the computer, but he came from IIT Kanpur, and Professor C.R. Muthukrishnan also joined in from IIT Kanpur. And they soon started an IIT MTech program. And there is a very interesting anecdote on how Chris joined the MTech program in computer science. But for that, I think you should read the book. Absolutely. So, IIT Madras did a lot of very interesting projects with the IBM 370. One was for the Asiad Games. I mean, we all know that the Asiad Games was the first in terms of color TV in India. But it was also the first time when in India, where a sports event had computerized scores displayed. Oh, wow. So, a lot of interesting stuff happening in IIT Madras. And there was also a movie which was shot in the IIT Madras Computer Center. So, a lot of interesting stuff happened there. So, and most of the research that we see now in India in computer science are happening at the IITs and at the Indian Institute of Science. So, the educational institutes were the ones who created this all. Plus, most important, the early captains of Indian IT were all from the IITs, be it IIT Kanpur or IIT Madras, IIT Bombay. So they were the, they were the source of the talent for the IT industry at its genesis.
Right, and but it wasn't just the IITs, right? So, Mr. Narayanan, if you could tell us a little more about the contributions of institutions like ISI and TIFR in the journey of the Indian IT sector.
Right. No, in fact, ISI, you could argue was the starting point for the first computer. Literally, the first computer of India landed at ISI. And thanks to the efforts of Professor Mahalanobis. So he had done seminal work in terms of, developing techniques for surveys. And they did a lot of crop surveys and so on. In fact, the very first instance of the use of the word computer actually didn't involve a computer machine, but human beings who used to do the computing were called computers.
Literally a computer.
They were called computers, right? And we talk about that in the book as well. But we had the first machine that came from England, the BTM HEC 2M machine that landed at ISI Kolkata. And of course, then the sort of the computing thing shifted, let's say, from the east to the west, where Homi Bhabha had set up TIFR and the extraordinary work that TIFR did in promoting, computing research. The TIFRAC, which was the first machine that was built at TIFR. In fact, if you look at the specifications of the TIFRAC, they were in fact even better than the IBM machine of that time. But unfortunately, we just built one TIFRAC, and we didn't develop that into an industry. Maybe a missed opportunity there. And I will also say this: not only TIFR, but I'll also put in IIM Ahmedabad as a of course, Mr. Murthy, after he left, after he finished his MTech in IIT Kanpur, the first job that he took was actually at IIM Ahmedabad to set up the computer center there, along with Professor Krishnaiah. And it was a cutting edge, state-of-the-art computer center that got set up. So it is not just the IITs, not just the technical institutions, but the management institutions too that ended up helping the Indian IT industry.
Brilliant, and all of this is documented in the book. Right, and so now finally, I come to our last question, which I wanted to ask all three of you. What's next for the IT sector, especially now that we have these fourth industrial revolution technologies like AI, quantum computing, robotics? So what's next? So Mr. Gopalakrishnan, first you.
So every one of these transitions requires large companies to change their IT system, to transform their IT system, to add new capabilities. And this results in more work for the IT industry. So I'm very optimistic about the future. I believe that as long as the industry is creating new products, new capabilities, there will be work for the IT industry, and it will continue to grow. And India is today the de facto location where this work is being done. So I'm very optimistic about this industry, and its impact now is visible in the startup ecosystem, in the whole Digital India program. So I believe that India has the opportunity to lead the whole digital revolution. We have done that in fintech. We can do that in healthcare. We can do that in education. With ONDC, we are doing that in the digital commerce space. I think we have an opportunity to demonstrate, rather than our soft power, our software power.
Wonderful. And Mr. Dayasindu?
So, entirely agree with Chris. He's seen it all. So I think we are at a great time in our history. So where Indian capability in IT is world class, and we are continuing to improve on our capabilities, starting and strengthening our research and innovation ecosystem as well. So I expect to see a lot of fundamental research in computer science and allied multidisciplinary fields, including brain science, in the next decade or so. And India not only becoming users, but also generating some of these new software paradigms. That's one. And this translation of this research will obviously kickstart a whole new genre of deep tech companies. So right now we look at something which emanates from the West, and then the rest of the world follows. But hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, we should see a lot more of these deep tech companies coming out of India. And finally, I see that our Indian IT industry growing from strength to strength. So I see, there are a lot of changes in technology, but the fundamental model around which our Indian IT services industry is built will continue and will continue to get stronger. So all in all, I think it's great times for Indian IT.
Wonderful. And Mr. Narayanan?
Right. So one of the things is in this kind of a setup where people have spoken, it's like now I have to refer to the book to see what we have written. No, but I just want to highlight one thing, which is the skill development, right? I think this is fundamental. Chris talked about it, how there is a need for reskilling, upskilling constantly. I think there are, India, in a way, that is the need to skill and upskill millions of people. The IT industry is demonstrating it by the way they are reskilling their employees. We now have the educational institutions pitching in. You have like the IIT Madras with its online BSc degree, where in one shot they are teaching 10,000 students. So these are innovations which I think which we can offer to the world, and I think the skilling is something which is very important for the industry, and I think we are sort of geared as an industry to take care of that.
Right. So that concludes our discussion. Thank you so much for your time, all three of you. And so there you have it. All of these thoughts and much more, many anecdotes, interesting stories are all there in this book, Against All Odds, which will be releasing on the 24th of October. So go to your nearest bookstore and check it out.